The desert stretched out endlessly, a vast ocean of sand under the pale glare of a sinking sun. Heat shimmered off the airfield tarmac, bending the horizon like a mirage. Captain Daniel Reynolds walked with the steady stride of a man who had lived too many days in the furnace of war. His flight helmet rested under one arm, the desert wind kicking grit against his boots as he approached the Apache attack helicopter waiting like a steel predator. He had flown dozens of missions across the Middle East, each one carrying the same blend of routine and danger. But this mission felt different. The tension wasn't just in the air. It was in the silence of the hangar, in the way the mechanics avoided eye contact, in the clipped tone of the colonel's orders. Pinned infantry. Heavy fire from a fortified village. Civilians caught in the crossfire. The ground units couldn't push forward without air cover. If Reynolds and his crew failed, the casualty numbers would spiral out of control. "Captain Reynolds," a voice called. He turned. A young sergeant in olive fatigues approached, her frame compact but sharp, movements purposeful. Her name patch read Torres. She carried a weapons diagnostic kit in one hand and her helmet tucked under the other. "Sergeant Elena Torres, reporting as ordered," she said crisply, snapping a salute. Reynolds returned it, studying her in the brief silence that followed. He had skimmed her file before the mission, recently transferred from another Army aviation unit, specialized in weapon systems maintenance, decorated twice for technical excellence. On paper, she was exactly what the Apache needed, someone meticulous, dependable, steady under pressure. But paper never told the full story. "You're with me today," Reynolds said. "That minigun's been giving us hell the past week. Last thing I need is for it to jam in the middle of suppressing fire." Her expression didn't flicker. "It won't jam, sir. Not if I'm on it." There was no arrogance in her voice, only conviction. Reynolds gave a small nod, gesturing toward the bird. Together, they walked across the tarmac. The Apache loomed ahead, black, angular, bristling with weapons. Its rotors clicked softly in the hot wind, like the calm breath before a storm. Inside the hangar, a briefing table was set up. Maps of the target village were spread across it, red markers showing known enemy positions, blue for the friendly units pinned down. Radio chatter buzzed in the background, reports of heavy machine gun fire, RPG ambushes, shifting hostile lines. Colonel Mason stood at the head of the table, his jaw tight. "Listen up. Our boys are stuck outside this village. Enemies entrenched, rooftop gunners, technicals with mounted DSHKs, maybe even a manpad if we're unlucky. Infantry can't move forward without close air support. Reynolds, you and your crew are tasked with clearing rooftops and softening defenses so they can push in." He looked at Torres. "Sergeant, this is no maintenance run. You'll be live in combat, managing the weapon systems. Can you handle that?" Torres didn't blink. "Yes, sir." Mason studied her for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines of her calm reply. Then he nodded. "Good. The mission launches in 10. Gear up." Reynolds caught Torres's eye as they walked away. There was something about her composure calm, almost too calm for someone about to climb into an Apache on a live fire op. Most new techs had at least a hint of nerves their first time out. Torres carried none. They reached the bird, and Torres immediately got to work. She moved along the weapon stations with surgical precision, hands gliding over ammunition feeds, belts, and mounts. She checked the 30mm chain gun, tapped gauges, cleared the feed trays, and resecured every latch. Then she crouched beside the minigun, her focus narrowing. Reynolds strapped into his seat, watching her in the reflection of the canopy glass. She wasn't just following procedure. She moved like someone who had done this in worse conditions, under pressure far beyond what a training manual could replicate. "You've done this before," he said, half a statement, half a question. Her reply was flat. It's what I do. The rotors above them began to turn, slow at first, then faster, until the air thumped with the deep heartbeat of the Apache. Reynolds adjusted his helmet, linked into the comm system, and glanced one last time at the desert horizon. Another mission. Another chance to come back or not. But something about today gnawed at him, a sense that the mission wasn't the only unknown. The woman seated beside him, calm as stone, carried a weight he couldn't see. The Apache lifted off, dust billowing beneath it like a storm. Reynolds tightened his grip on the controls, eyes locked on the horizon. Torres, quiet in the seat beside him, watched the landscape shrink beneath them, her hand brushing unconsciously against her sleeve. The battle ahead awaited them. But for Reynolds, the real mystery had already begun. The desert village came into view, a jagged cluster of mud brick buildings, alleyways like veins running through its heart. Smoke curled upward, black against the fading light. From above, Reynolds could already see the firefight raging. Tracer rounds stitched the sky, RPG flashes streaked upward, and the stuttering echo of machine gun fire rolled through his headset. "Ground team, this is Viper 1. We're on station," Reynolds called into comms, his voice calm but clipped. "Copy that, Viper 1," came the strained reply. "We're pinned down at grid mark Bravo 7. Heavy fire from rooftops, multiple positions. We can't move. Hang on, boys. We've got you," Reynolds muttered. He angled the Apache low, the desert wind rattling the cockpit. Torres had her systems alive before he even asked. A 30mm chain gun swiveled, locking onto a rooftop where enemy gunners were spraying rounds down at the pinned infantry. "Target acquired," she said flatly, her voice clear, unshaken. "Light them up," Reynolds ordered. The gun barked. Explosions tore through the rooftop, sending chunks of mud brick collapsing. Hostiles scattered, but more gunfire erupted from a side street. Another rooftop. Another technical rolling into position with a mounted heavy machine gun. "Switching to the minigun," Torres said, already realigning. The barrels spun, a metallic whine filling the cockpit. Then silence. The whine sputtered. The gun locked. "Damn it," Reynolds growled. Torres didn't flinch. "Gun jammed," she said, her voice as steady as if she were announcing the time. "We don't have time for this," Reynolds snapped. Bullets streaked past the canopy, one pinging hard against the armor plating. He banked the Apache hard to the left, buying them seconds. "Can you clear it?" "I can," she said, already unbuckling. Reynolds stole a glance. "Torres, this isn't a maintenance bay. We're in live combat. One mistake, I know what I'm doing." Her voice cut through the chaos, cool and razor sharp. She was already braced against the seat frame, tools pulled from her kit, body swaying with the violent motion of the helicopter. The straps bit into her shoulders, but she leaned forward anyway, reaching into the weapon housing. Her hands moved too fast for someone supposedly new to combat deployments. Reynolds jerked the Apache into a climb, tracers chasing them through the sky. Sweat beaded under his helmet. He had to keep the bird moving or they'd be shredded, but every turn made her job harder. Still, she never cursed, never hesitated. "Status?" he barked. Halfway. Her sleeve shifted as she twisted, her arm exposed to the cockpit lights. That's when Reynolds saw it. Ink, black, worn by time, but unmistakable. A Navy SEAL trident. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to fall away. Reynolds's mind blanked, hands gripping the cyclic tighter than the controls required. That tattoo didn't belong here. Not on her. Not in this cockpit. He knew that symbol. He'd seen it carved into the skin of warriors who operated in shadows, ghosts the army rarely crossed paths with. And once years ago, he'd seen it in the dark, on the arm of the mysterious operator who had dragged him out of hell when his squad was cornered in a nameless canyon. The memory hit him like a flashbang. The gunfire, the screams, the chaos of that ambush. And through it all, the blur of a figure fast, precise, lethal. She had cut down enemy fighters with surgical efficiency, her arm steady, even as the battlefield collapsed around her. He had caught only glimpses, but one thing had burned into his mind, that trident inked on her skin. Now it was here, right in front of him. On Sergeant Torres. He nearly missed a control input, forcing himself back to the present as a streak of tracer fire whipped past. Torres hadn't noticed his stare. She was too busy working the jam, her hands steady despite the violence around them. Almost there, she muttered. Reynolds's pulse hammered. Questions flooded his mind, but none had answers. How could she be here? A weapons tech? Her file had shown nothing, no history in naval special warfare, no record of classified operations. And yet, here she was, carrying the mark of an operator whose existence was supposed to be buried in black ink and sealed documents. A sharp click rang out. Cleared, Torres announced. The minigun spun up again, this time roaring back to life with a furious hum. She locked onto the technical below, unleashing a torrent of fire that ripped the vehicle apart in seconds. Flames engulfed it, the explosion shaking the rooftops. "Good work," Reynolds said, his voice hoarse. "Just doing my job," she replied coolly, as though she hadn't just risked her life in mid-air to fix a jammed weapon under live fire. Reynolds guided the Apache lower, strafing across rooftops. The infantry below cheered over cones as enemy fire began to dwindle, suppressed under the fury of the helicopter's guns. The mission was shifting back in their favor. But Reynolds's mind wasn't on the battlefield anymore. It was on the woman sitting beside him. Every movement she made, every calm decision, screamed of training far beyond what her records claimed. She wasn't just some army weapons tech. She was something else, someone else. And Reynolds realized, with a chill running down his spine, that the battle outside wasn't the only war being fought. There was another, quieter war inside the cockpit, a war of recognition, of secrets long buried, of a past that had just clawed its way into the present. For the rest of the mission, Reynolds didn't say a word. He couldn't. The sound of the guns filled the silence between them, but his thoughts were deafening. The seal trident burned in his memory, and he knew without a doubt that nothing about Sergeant Elena Torres was what it seemed. The desert sky bled into twilight, the sun sinking low and leaving streaks of crimson across the horizon. The Apache thundered overhead, cutting through smoke and chaos as Reynolds wrestled with the controls. Below, the firefight raged, a living battlefield of tracer fire and shouting voices carried through cones. But inside the cockpit, Reynolds's focus wasn't on the rooftops or the enemy positions. It was locked on the woman beside him, Sergeant Elena Torres, whose sleeve had slipped just enough to betray the ink beneath. The seal trident. Reynolds's pulse kicked hard, almost outpacing the steady thrum of the rotors. That tattoo didn't belong here. Not on her. Not in his Apache. He tried to drag his mind back to the present, to the mission, but the past rose like a ghost he could not ignore. It was 6 years ago. A different desert. Different enemy. His unit had been on a night raid, tasked with pulling a high-value target out of a labyrinth of caves. Everything had gone wrong. The intel was bad, the enemy numbers overwhelming. They were ambushed, trapped in a canyon with nowhere to run. RPG fire lit the walls like fireworks, and his men were falling one by one. Reynolds had thought it was the end. He remembered crouching behind a boulder, weapon nearly empty, the screams of wounded soldiers filling his headset. And then she appeared. Not with the rest of them. Not with his unit. a lone shadow slipping through the dust and gunfire. She moved with precision, every step calculated, every shot exact. Enemies fell before they even realized she was there. Her rifle barked in short, efficient bursts, each one a death sentence. He remembered the way she dragged his wounded sergeant behind cover, how she barked orders like someone who had no rank yet commanded absolute authority. And he remembered, in the chaos, a flash of her arm, a trident tattoo glistening with sweat and grit. A Navy SEAL, a ghost. A woman who shouldn't have existed in the records he knew. And when the dust cleared, when the survivors stumbled back to their exfil, she was gone. No name, no trace. Only whispers among the men that they had been saved by someone who wasn't supposed to exist. For years, Reynolds had convinced himself that memory had blurred in the trauma of battle. That perhaps he had imagined her. That no such operator had been there. But now, here she was. The same calm in her movements. The same steel in her eyes. And the same ink, undeniable. Torres didn't notice his stare. She was too busy, scanning rooftops through the targeting display, her hands steady on the controls. She fired a burst from the chain gun, collapsing a sniper nest and sending debris spilling into the street below. Her voice cut through comms. Rooftop clear. 2 more targets at grid Bravo 8. Reynolds forced his voice steady. Copy. He banked the Apache, tracing the line of buildings. His body moved on instinct, but his mind was elsewhere. He was fighting 2 battles, one against the enemy, and another against the storm of recognition inside him. Finally, when a lull opened in the chaos, he couldn't stop himself. Torres, he said, his voice tight in her headset. She didn't look at him. Eyes on target, Captain. That tattoo, he pressed. Her hands paused, only for a fraction of a second, but he caught it. Then she resumed, cool and efficient. Just ink, she said. Doesn't mean anything. Don't lie to me, Reynolds shot back. His tone was sharper than he intended, but the tension in his chest was suffocating. I'm not here to talk about tattoos, she said flatly. Maybe not. But I remember. This time, she turned her head, her eyes flicking toward him beneath the low red glow of the cockpit lights. For the first time since he'd met her, her mask cracked. It was small, a tightening around her jaw, the faintest flicker in her gaze, but it was enough. Reynolds pressed. It was you. 6 years ago. The canyon. You pulled my men out when we were dead and buried. You were there. Her lips parted, but no words came. For a moment, the only sound was the relentless thumping of the rotors. Then, quietly, you shouldn't remember that. The words were soft, but they carried the weight of something heavier than steel. Reynolds felt the chill crawl up his spine. You disappeared. No record. No name. I thought I imagined you. Her gaze lingered on him for a second longer, then snapped back to the targeting display. Focus on the mission, Captain. That's an order. It wasn't her place to give orders. But the authority in her tone left no room for argument. Below, the ground team called out again. Viper 1, enemy reinforcements inbound. East Road, 2 trucks, heavy weapons mounted. Reynolds cursed, jerking the Apache toward the coordinates. Torres was already locking the chain gun. She fired in controlled bursts, cutting the first truck to pieces. The second swerved, fighters spilling out before the wreck could explode. Marking survivors, she said. Her voice was steady again, but Reynolds could hear the faint edge beneath it. The conversation wasn't over. He strafed low, blasting the survivors back into the dirt. The battlefield roared around them, but inside the cockpit, the silence between words was louder. The SEAL trident wasn't just ink. It was a story, one written in blood, classified files, and ghosts of missions no one spoke about. And Sergeant Elena Torres, Whoever she truly was, carried it into his Apache like a shadow that refused to stay buried. Reynolds knew one thing with certainty. The mission ahead was dangerous, but the truth sitting beside him might be even more so. And for the first time in years, Captain Daniel Reynolds felt something he didn't like: fear. The battlefield below glowed like embers in the fading light. The Apache banked hard, dipping low over rooftops as Reynolds adjusted his grip on the cyclic. Every move he made was instinct, years of muscle memory guiding him through the chaos. But inside his head, a storm refused to quiet. The trident. The way she moved. The steel in her voice when she told him to focus on the mission. Every detail stacked into a truth Reynolds couldn't unsee. Elena Torres wasn't who her file claimed she was. She couldn't be. He knew her, though he had only seen her once, in shadows and firelight years ago. Back then, the world had felt like it was ending. His unit, cut off in a canyon, had no way out. His men were bleeding, morale broken. He had radioed for support, but static answered. He'd felt the weight of leadership crush him. This is how we die, he'd thought. Then came the ghost. She hadn't spoken her name, hadn't worn a uniform that marked her branch. Her gear had been stripped of insignia, her face streaked with camouflage. She moved like a phantom, sliding through gunfire as if death itself couldn't touch her. Reynolds had thought she was just another hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But she was real. He knew because she had touched his arm, gripping him with strength that cut through his fog. "Get your men moving," she'd ordered. And somehow he had listened. Now that same woman sat next to him, wearing an army patch and the rank of sergeant. Torres didn't acknowledge his staring. Her eyes stayed locked on the targeting display, her hands steady on the fire controls. She called out ranges, marked targets, gave crisp, professional updates. To anyone listening in, she was just another soldier doing her job. But Reynolds could see the cracks. Tiny ones, almost invisible. The way she avoided meeting his gaze. The fraction of hesitation when he'd said, "You were there." He knew better than to push her. Not here, not now. But inside, recognition burned like a brand. "Viper 1, this is Bravo 7, the ground team called in overcomes." Their voices were ragged, desperate. "We've secured the west flank, but we're still taking fire from the central compound. We can't break through without more cover." "Copy, Bravo 7, Reynolds replied, his voice steady even as his thoughts raced. "We're on it." He swung the Apache toward the compound. The building was reinforced, a hard target, enemy fighters bristling from its windows like hornets defending a nest. "Chain gun," he ordered. Torres already had it lined up. The weapon thundered, shaking the cockpit as rounds tore through walls and bodies. Plumes of dust erupted, drowning the streets below. The enemy's fire slackened, but didn't stop. "Multiple contacts still active," Torres said calmly. Reynolds glanced at her again. Her expression was unreadable, but he knew what he was seeing. Not just calm control. The kind of control you only earned in shadows, in missions where a single mistake meant your name never made it home. It hit him then, harder than before. The army hadn't simply misfiled her record. Someone had buried it, hidden her past beneath layers of bureaucracy and silence. And for good reason. Operators like her weren't meant to exist on paper. Reynolds' throat tightened. He wanted to say something to demand the truth, to tell her he remembered every detail of that night. But when he opened his mouth, no words came. Because some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. The Apache shuddered as a burst of machine gun fire rattled against its armor. Reynolds cursed, banking hard left. He felt the G-forces slam him into his seat, the horizon tilting violently. "Contact, east rooftop," Torres shouted. He leveled out, giving her the angle. She squeezed the trigger. The chain gun spat fire, silencing the rooftop in a storm of dust and blood. For a moment, silence filled the comms. The ground team's frantic chatter dulled. The only sound was the thrum of the rotors and the hiss of the radio static. Reynolds let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good work," he muttered. Torres didn't respond. She just reloaded the ammo feed, her face lit by the glow of the targeting screen. That silence between them said more than words ever could. He wanted to tell her what he remembered. The way she had moved through the canyon like an avenging spirit. The way she had saved his men without asking for recognition, only to vanish before dawn. He wanted to thank her, to demand why she had hidden herself, to ask what ghosts had driven her into his cockpit under a false name. But he couldn't, not here. Not with enemy fire still licking at their tail. Not with her so clearly determined to keep her mask in place. So instead, Reynolds stayed silent. He flew, she fired, and together they turned the battlefield into ruin. Unspoken recognition hung between them, heavy as the desert air. When the ground team finally reported the compound breached and enemy fire suppressed, Reynolds felt the weight in his chest ease slightly. But the questions inside him only grew heavier. As he banked the Apache toward the extraction zone, the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert cloaked in shadow. Fitting, Reynolds thought grimly. Because shadows were exactly where Sergeant Elena Torres had come from. And no matter how much she tried to bury it, he knew the truth now. The ghost who had once saved his life was sitting right beside him. And this time, she wasn't vanishing. Not yet. The desert night was alive with fire. Tracers stitched the air, arcs of light carving across the village like angry comets. The Apache roared through the chaos, blades thundering above Reynolds' head. He gritted his teeth, banking hard as RPGs streaked past, detonating in dirty blossoms of fire. In the seat beside him, Sergeant Elena Torres moved with the calm efficiency of a surgeon. No hesitation, no panic. The jammed minigun was still cooling from earlier, and she had restored it mid-battle like it was nothing more than a stubborn wrench in a motor pool. Reynolds had watched her fingers dance over the weapon housing, pulling, twisting, slamming the feed into place until the barrel spun alive again with that unmistakable hum. Now it was roaring. Torres unleashed it across a rooftop where muzzle flashes erupted like sparks. The minigun chewed the building to dust, its deafening whir filling the cockpit. Glass shattered. Bricks crumbled. Enemy fighters toppled in sprays of sand and debris. The infantry below roared through comms. That's it. Push forward. Move, move. Reynolds stole a glance at Torres. Her jaw was tight, her eyes locked forward, her hands steady. She didn't flinch at the carnage, didn't blink at the chaos. She operated the weapon as though she'd been born with it in her hands. But Reynolds knew better. That control wasn't born. It was forged in blood, sweat, and shadows. The seal trident burned in his mind again, but he shoved it aside. For now, the battlefield demanded his focus. Target, alleyway to the north, Torres said, voice cool as steel. He banked left, and the Apache dipped low, hugging the rooftops. Enemy fighters poured from an alley, RPGs on their shoulders. Torres swung the minigun down and shredded the line before the launchers could ignite. Explosions rocked the narrow street as ammunition cooked off. Clear, she confirmed, not a trace of emotion in her tone. Reynolds felt the air thicken inside the cockpit. Her efficiency was breathtaking, terrifying, even. She wasn't just good. She was beyond good. And he knew what that meant. She doesn't belong here. The ground team's voice cracked through comms. Viper 1, you just saved our asses. Compound secure. We're moving to exfil. Request overwatch. Copy, Bravo 7, Reynolds replied, his voice calmer than he felt. We'll cover you. He leveled the Apache, scanning the village. Fires burned in the streets, casting long shadows across the sand. The pinned infantry moved through the smoke, their silhouettes small but determined. Above them, the Apache hovered like a guardian angel with teeth. Torres reloaded the minigun, movements automatic. Reynolds couldn't stop himself. He had to say it. You cleared that jam faster than any tech I've flown with. She didn't look at him. That's the job. No, he pressed. That's more than the job. That's experience. Combat experience. Silence. Only the rotors answered him. Reynolds pushed further. You've done this before. Haven't you? Finally, she looked at him. Just for a second. Her eyes, dark, sharp, guarded, met his. Then she turned back to her controls. You think too much, Captain, she said. He almost laughed. Almost. But the weight in her voice wasn't playful. It was a wall. The mission wasn't over yet. More hostiles were moving on the edge of the village, hoping to flank the retreating infantry. Reynolds guided the Apache lower, Torres tracking targets with the chain gun now. She fired in precise bursts, each round finding its mark. Bodies fell in the sand, the threat broken before it could grow. As the ground team reached the exfil point, Reynolds pulled the Apache into a wide orbit, scanning for last-minute threats. His chest tightened as he looked at Torres again. Every motion, every decision, she was proving herself over and over. The doubts he'd had about her paper file evaporated. This wasn't some ordinary sergeant. This was the operator who had once saved him. The ghost of a classified past. And now, she had just saved an entire company. The doubt wasn't hers. It was his. He doubted the system that had hidden her. He doubted the army that had reassigned her as a weapons tech instead of what she truly was. And most of all, he doubted his ability to keep flying beside her without demanding answers. But as the Apache circled above the village, Reynolds realized something else. It didn't matter what her past was. In this moment, in this fight, she had cleared more than a jammed weapon. She had cleared his doubt. Torres belonged here, not on paper, not in files, not in the tidy boxes of military bureaucracy. She belonged here in the fire, where lives depended on her calm, her skill, her ruthless precision. The battlefield was the truth, and Sergeant Elena Torres was as real as it got. Reynolds exhaled slowly, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. He didn't thank her. He didn't press her further. Not yet. Instead, he focused on the sky ahead, the desert rolling away beneath them. The battle was ending, but something far bigger had begun. The bond between them wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. It was forged in that jam, in the fire, in the silence of recognition. For now, Reynolds accepted it. But deep down, he knew the questions hadn't gone away. They had only grown sharper. And one day soon, he would demand the truth. The Apache's rotors groaned as Reynolds eased the bird down onto the forward operating base's landing pad. Dust billowed in the downdraft, coating everything in a fine, gritty haze. Mechanics and ground crew rushed forward, guiding the chopper in, but Reynolds hardly saw them. His mind was locked on the woman sitting beside him. Sergeant Elena Torres hadn't flinched the entire flight back. She kept her headset on, eyes fixed ahead, posture as rigid as if she were still in combat. The minigun she had coaxed back to life sat silent now, its barrels gleaming faintly in the floodlights. Reynolds powered down the engines, the thrum fading into a tense quiet. He unbuckled slowly, but Torres was already unclipping, her movements precise and efficient, as though eager to escape the cockpit. "Good flying, Captain," she said flatly, removing her headset. Her tone was all business, the kind of practiced professionalism soldiers used when they wanted to build walls instead of bridges. Reynolds didn't answer. He climbed out of the seat and met her on the tarmac, the desert night pressing down heavy and hot. The base bustled with activity crew fueling other birds, medics rushing stretchers, officers barking into radios, but for him, it all blurred into background noise. It was just him. And her. "Torres," he said, catching her arm before she could walk toward the hangar. She froze. Slowly, she turned her head, eyes locking with his. In the harsh floodlight, he could see it again, the faint scar running along her jawline, the intensity in her stare. "What is it, Captain?" she asked, her voice steady but clipped. He lowered his tone, making sure no one around them could overhear. "That tattoo, the trident." Her eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Enough for Reynolds to know he'd hit the nerve she tried so hard to hide. "You saw wrong," she said flatly, pulling her arm free. "Don't do that," Reynolds snapped, more harshly than he intended. "Don't lie to me. I know what I saw. And I know who you are." Torres's jaw tightened. She looked away, scanning the bustling pad as if hoping someone would interrupt them. But no one did. "Even if you're right," she said finally, her voice low, "you don't want to know the truth." Reynolds stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "You saved my life once. My men's lives. Years ago, in that canyon. I never forgot. And now you're here, in my bird, wearing an army patch like none of that ever happened. You think I can just ignore that?" Her eyes snapped back to his. For a moment, the mask cracked, and he saw something raw flicker there, pain, anger, maybe even guilt. "You were never supposed to remember me," she said quietly. The words hit him harder than gunfire. Never supposed to remember. What the hell does that mean? He demanded. Torres shook her head, her expression hardening again. "It means classified is classified. You asking questions won't change anything. And it won't get you answers." Reynolds's fists clenched at his sides. "Then tell me this. Why are you here? Why bury your past just to sit in my cockpit?" For the first time all night, Torres looked uncertain. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though waging a battle inside herself. Finally, she whispered, "Because sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear." Reynolds stared at her, searching her face for more. But she had already shut the door, her mask sliding back into place. She stepped past him, boots crunching on the gravel as she walked toward the barracks. He wanted to follow her, to force the truth out, to demand why she was living in shadows. But his body wouldn't move. Her words pinned him where he stood. Sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear. The phrase echoed in his mind as the night air swirled with sand and jet fuel. He had seen soldiers break, seen them run, seen them vanish into substances or silence. But Torres wasn't broken. She was sharper than anyone he'd ever flown with. If she had disappeared, it wasn't weakness. It was choice. And choices like that didn't come without blood in their wake. Reynolds rubbed his face, trying to steady his thoughts. She was hiding something bigger than herself, something that went beyond a trident tattoo or a buried mission report, something that had forced her to trade an identity for a shadow. He turned, watching her retreating figure vanish into the darkness beyond the floodlights. A chill rippled through him, one the desert heat couldn't chase away. Whatever truth Torres carried, it was dangerous. And Reynolds knew one thing with absolute certainty. The battlefield had tied them together again for a reason. This time, he wouldn't let her vanish. The desert base had its own rhythm. Generators hummed through the night, radios crackled with clipped voices, boots scuffed against gravel in endless patrols. But for Captain Mark Reynolds, none of it registered. His mind was a storm that refused to quiet. Sergeant Elena Torres. The SEAL Trident. Sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear. Those words clung to him like smoke. He tried to sleep, but his cot felt like stone. He tried to eat, but every bite turned to dust in his mouth. Eventually, he gave up pretending. In the dim light of the operations tent, he began pulling files. Officially, Torres's record was clean. Too clean. Born in El Paso, enlisted at 19, Army Aviation Weapons Specialist, decorated for technical proficiency. A perfect file on paper, except that perfection was the problem. Soldiers had scars, mistakes, transfers, marks of humanity. Hers read like it had been built in a lab. Reynolds knew the signs. He had worked with spooks before, men and women whose lives on record were more fiction than fact. Torres's file had the same smell, curated, scrubbed, sanitized. He leaned back in the creaking chair, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Why? Why erase a past so thoroughly? Why bury a trident? The answer gnawed at him until dawn. Torres, meanwhile, sat alone in the barracks, her gear laid out on the bunk like ritual objects. She moved her hands over each piece slowly, methodically, helmet, vest, tools like someone grounding herself against ghosts. The confrontation replayed in her head. Reynolds's eyes when he'd said, "I know who you are." The way his voice had carried anger and hurt, not accusation. It rattled her more than she wanted to admit. She had spent years perfecting the art of erasure slipping into new roles, burying what came before. Yet one pilot's memory had cut through her armor. Her fingers brushed the faint outline of the trident tattoo beneath her sleeve. Old ink, nearly faded now, but not enough. She should have burned it off years ago. But she hadn't. A piece of her had refused to let go. And now that piece threatened to unravel everything. 2 nights later, Reynolds made his move. He found Torres outside the motor pool, working late under a floodlight. She was elbow-deep in a weapons housing. Grease streaked across her arms. "Don't you ever sleep?" he asked, stepping out of the shadows. She didn't look up. "Don't you ever mind your own business?" Reynolds smirked faintly, though his chest felt heavy. "I've been trying. But it's hard when the Army puts a ghost in my cockpit." This time she paused. Slowly, she set down her tools and looked at him. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes burned. "You think you're entitled to answers," she said. "You're not. Maybe not," he admitted, stepping closer. "But I am entitled to know who's covering my 6. And right now, all I know is that the woman sitting next to me isn't who the paperwork says she is." Torres's jaw tightened. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the floodlight. Then, with a quiet sigh, she wiped her hands on a rag. "You want the truth, Captain?" she asked softly. "The truth doesn't make anything better. It doesn't give closure. It only makes things heavier. Try me." Her gaze lingered on him, searching, as though weighing how much he could carry. Then she looked away. "I was part of a unit that doesn't exist. Not officially. Not on record. We went places where the flag never flew, fought battles no one was supposed to know about. When it went bad, when people died, the easiest way to bury it was to bury us." Reynolds felt his chest tighten. He had suspected, but hearing it aloud, hearing the cost in her voice, was something else. "They gave us new files," Torres continued, her voice low and bitter. "New names, new ranks, new uniforms. Told us to blend in, to disappear, because that was safer than admitting what we'd done in their name." Reynolds swallowed hard. "And you went along with it?" Torres's eyes flicked to his. For the first time, he saw not the unshakable operator, but the woman beneath, the one who carried too much weight. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "You don't say no to ghosts. You become one." The words hung in the night air, heavy as the desert heat. Reynolds wanted to push further, to ask about the canyon, about why she had saved him. But something in her expression stopped him. She was giving him more than she should already. Pushing harder might shut her down forever. So instead, he said quietly, "You're not a ghost to me." Her eyes softened for the briefest moment. Then the mask slid back into place. "Then do me a favor, Captain," she said, picking up her tools again. "Keep it that way." Reynolds stood there, torn between frustration and respect. He had wanted answers. Now he had fragments enough to know Torres's hidden past was darker than he imagined, but not enough to understand the full picture. Still, one thing was clear. The army hadn't buried her past to protect her. They had buried it to protect themselves. And Reynolds knew he couldn't let it rest. As he walked away from the motor pool, the night felt heavier than ever. Torres's past wasn't just her burden anymore. Now it was his too. And he couldn't shake the feeling that before long, that past was going to catch up with both of them. A call came just before dawn. Reynolds was jolted awake by the sharp crackle of the radio in his quarters. "Scramble, scramble. All air crews to stations." His boots hit the floor before his eyes were fully open. He grabbed his flight suit, heart already pounding. Minutes later, the Apache's rotors thundered to life. Across the pad, other birds spun up, the base buzzing with sudden urgency. Reports filtered through. An Allied convoy had been ambushed in the mountains. Survivors were pinned, surrounded, with little chance of lasting until ground reinforcements arrived. Reynolds climbed into the cockpit, adrenaline coursing hot. Torres was already there, strapping in, her movements sharp and wordless. The floodlights carved her profile in stark relief, and for the first time, Reynolds thought she looked less like a soldier and more like a blade-honed, hidden, dangerous. "Ready?" he asked. Her eyes met his for a beat. Always, the Apache surged into the sky, banking hard toward the mountains. The horizon glowed faintly, pale fingers of dawn creeping up from the east. Below, the desert gave way to jagged ridges and narrow passes, the kind of terrain that turned ambushes into bloodbaths. As they neared the coordinates, the comms lit up with chaos. Gunfire, screams, broken transmissions. Reynolds's gut clenched. The convoy was in trouble. "There," Torres said sharply, pointing to the valley below. Smoke plumed upward, black and oily. Wrecked vehicles littered the road, flames licking at their twisted frames. Survivors were dug in behind the wreckage, their return fire sporadic and desperate. Enemy fighters swarmed the high ground, raining bullets and RPGs down like thunder. Reynolds dropped the Apache into a dive, rotors howling. The minigun roared, shredding the ridgeline. Enemy fighters scattered, some diving for cover, others falling where they stood. Torres moved like fire, shifting between the chain gun and rockets with lethal precision. But the enemy was prepared. A burst of tracer fire ripped past, grazing the tail. Warning alarms blared inside the cockpit. Reynolds cursed, yanking the controls to stabilize the bird. "We're not shaking them off," he growled. Then we hit harder. Torres snapped back, eyes blazing. She unleashed rockets into the ridgeline. Explosions tore the mountainside apart, sending rock and sand cascading down. The ambushers screamed in panic as the earth itself betrayed them. Reynolds risked a glance at her. She wasn't just fighting. She was commanding. Every shot, every angle, every choice, it was strategy born of countless missions like this one. And suddenly, he understood. This wasn't just another op for her. This was who she had been all along. The ghost was alive again. As the Apache pressed the attack, a call cut through the comms. They're flanking us from the north. We need cover now. Reynolds swung the bird, but the angle was bad. The enemy had set up a heavy machine gun on the far ridge, perfectly positioned to cut the convoy survivors to pieces. I can't get the line, Reynolds said, frustration biting his voice. Then I will, Torres replied. Before he could stop her, she unbuckled. Torres, what the hell are you? She ignored him, moving to the gunner's bay. Her hands blurred as she adjusted the feed, bypassing safeties, forcing the minigun into a continuous overdrive. The barrel screamed as she held the trigger, walking fire across the ridge until the machine gun and its crew were nothing but smoke and silence. Reynolds felt his chest tighten. She wasn't just clearing jams anymore. She was rewriting the battle. When the last of the ambushers broke and fled, silence finally fell over the valley. The survivors' voices cracked through combs, raw with relief. Viper 1. You saved us. We thought we were done. Reynolds exhaled slowly, the tension bleeding out of him. He looked over at Torres. She was still at the gun, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the console. For the first time since it met her, she looked tired. Not physically soul tired. You didn't just save them, Reynolds said quietly. You revealed yourself. Torres turned her head, meeting his eyes. For once, there was no mask, no deflection. Just truth. I told you, Captain, she said softly. I was never supposed to be remembered. Missions like this, they weren't meant to exist. And neither was I. Reynolds' throat tightened. But you do exist. Right here, right now. You're the reason any of them are alive. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy as the mountain air. Then Torres let out a bitter laugh. Alive today, maybe. But shadows catch up, Reynolds. They always do. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong. But deep down, he knew she wasn't. People like her weren't meant for the light. The system would never allow it. Still, as he guided the Apache back toward base, he made a quiet vow. If Torres's past came hunting, she wouldn't face it alone. Back on the tarmac, medics rushed to treat the rescued convoy. Commanding officers barked orders, already debriefing the chaos. But Reynolds and Torres lingered in the cockpit, neither moving to leave. Reynolds finally broke the silence. So what happens now? Torres stared at the horizon, where dawn had fully broken, painting the sky in gold. For the first time, she looked almost human vulnerable, even. Now, she said softly, now I keep doing what I do best. Fighting in the shadows. Until the shadows swallow me whole. Reynolds shook his head. Not if I can help it. She looked at him then, truly looked, and for the briefest heartbeat, her walls lowered. He saw gratitude there. And fear. And something else she didn't dare name. The rotors clicked as they cooled, the base alive with noise around them. But in that cockpit, it was just the two of them. Two soldiers bound not by rank or orders, but by the weight of battles both past and yet to come. For Torres, the light was dangerous. It revealed too much, demanded truths she wasn't allowed to give. But for the first time in years, with Reynolds beside her, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, the shadows didn't have to be faced alone.